Do you speak more than one language? Have you ever felt that you think a little differently in each of these languages? I speak two languages, English and Hindi, and sometimes it feels like the language that I'm using to think affects my thoughts distinctly, which led me to believe that language must affect thought in some way. And learning a new language may change the way we think, like they show in the movie Arrival. Naturally, I started to research more into it and found about an Aboriginal Australian community where even a 5-year-old can point accurately to any direction that they're asked just because they speak a specific language that requires them to know it. You want to know what more I found out? Yeah. You want someone else to do all the work and just tell you everything unbiased. Yeah? Is that it? Because I will. Don't you test me. You think I won't? You think I won't? Watch this. Hindi has always been there since I was born. English came a little later, but soon it went from a language that I was translating in my head to a language that I thought and dreamt in as well. And since I've noticed a sort of distinction in the thought that arise when thinking in either language, which until now I thought had no weight to it. Interestingly enough, I found a part of linguistics and psychology that studies and has theories on exactly this since decades. Linguistics being the study of language and psychology being the study of the brain. I found out if and how language affects our thinking and vice versa. I found out how it affects bilinguals. I found out how this interesting sector of study is still being researched and the implications and importance of language in our culture, society, politics, media, and our evolution. If you ever skim through this topic anywhere, the first thing that you will come across is SAPIR-WHORF hypothesis, a term that wasn't coined by either of them. But we will soon come to that. But first, let's go a little bit further back to get a clearer picture. The idea that some languages are superior to others and that lesser languages kept their speakers in intellectual poverty was widespread during the early 20th century. American linguist William Dwight Whitney, for example, actively strove to eradicate Native American languages, arguing that their speakers were savages and would be better off learning English and adopting a civilized way of life. Franz Boas, on the other hand, was the first linguist to challenge this opinion. Boas stressed the equal worth of all cultures and languages, that there was no such thing as a primitive language, and that all languages were capable of expressing the same content, albeit by widely differing means. Boas saw language as an inseparable part of our culture. Boas' student Edward Sapir supported the opinion that because languages represented reality differently, it followed that the speakers of different languages would perceive reality differently. We will talk about some examples later when we come to the testing of this hypothesis. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis branches out into two theories: linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. Linguistic determinism is viewed as the stronger form because here language is viewed as a complete barrier. It implies that language and its grammatical structure limit and determine human knowledge or thought. While linguistic relativity is perceived as a weaker form of the theory, because here language's structures influence a speaker's perception without strictly limiting or obstructing them. It is important to know that Sapir explicitly rejected linguistic determinism by stating it would be naive to imagine that any analysis of experience is dependent on pattern expressed in language. Linguistic determinism was later discarded as a viable thesis for the same reasons. While Sapir never went on to study or prove directly how languages affected thought, it was later developed by Whorf. Benjamin Lee Whorf, a student of Edward Sapir, became associated with what he termed the linguistic relativity principle. Studying Native American languages, he attempted to account for the ways in which grammatical systems and language use differences affected someone's perception. It would be very ironic if I don't quote Woolf word to word here. He said, "We dissect nature along the lines laid down by our native language. The categories and types that we isolate from the world of phenomena, we do not find there because they stare every observer in the face. On the contrary, the world is presented in a kaleidoscope flux of impressions, which has to be organized by our minds. And this means largely by the linguistic systems of our minds, the language system. We cut up nature, organize it into concepts, and ascribe significances as we do, largely because we are parties to an agreement to organize it in this way. An agreement that is codified in all patterns of our language. All observers are not led by the same physical evidence to the same picture of the universe, unless their linguistic backgrounds are similar or can in some way be calibrated. In other words, he meant we organize reality through the lens of our language and its grammatical structures.
Really? That's all he said.
I mean, it's an oversimplification, but yes.
Mm-hmm.
Worf's opinions regarding the nature of the relation between language and thought remain under contention. His critiques, such as Lenberg, Chomsky, and Pinker, criticized him for insufficient clarity of his description of how language influences thought, and for not proving his conjectures. Most of his arguments were in the form of anecdotes and speculations. The claim that language functions as a way of defining experience appears to be offered as a kind of a vague metaphysical insight rather than either a statement of linguistic relativism or a testable hypothesis. So, what followed were a number of tests of this hypothesis, both from supporters and from critics alike. First, they studied memory for color in natives of different languages. However, at first the research proved that the two were not related. The color domain provides a strong instance of cultural universalism and linguistic insignificance. It argued strongly against the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The results suggested that experiences of colors are unaffected by language practices. The difficulty with these conclusions, as well founded as they are, is that they cannot logically be extended to conclude that there is no influence of language on thought. Although some experiences may be universal, but the ease with which various languages allow certain experiences to be expressed may still have an impact on ease of thought. Sapir and Whorf have often been caricatured as suggesting that of the two-way relation between language and thought, only one is true. This is clearly incorrect. We believe it is essential to acknowledge that thought influences language, while still allowing the possibility that language can affect thought. Language may have a small but consistent influence on thought. Genuine hypothesis about the effects of language on thought will always be twofold. There will be a linguistic part and a non linguistic part. The linguistic part will involve a claim that some feature is present in one language but absent in the other. Then the non linguistic part of the hypothesis will compare the psychological effects that habitually using the two languages with these differences has on their speakers. For example, one might suggest that the habitual use of Hindi induces its speakers to be sensitive to the formal or informal relationship with the other person, while habitually using English does not. In Hindi, for the word you would use the word aap to show respect and be formal, generally with elders, and use tum or tu to be casual and informal, generally with people younger than you or as the same age as you. While in English, you would use the word you for both. This is the linguistic part. The non-linguistic part would be then testing out what psychological effect does this have on the speakers of these languages. Let me know what you think the psychological differences between them would be in the comments below. So, testing the Whorfian hypothesis requires the expertise of both linguistics and psychology and is a multidisciplinary enterprise. Lera Boroditsky, a cognitive psychologist, uses the example of a 5-year-old girl in Pormpuraaw, a small Aboriginal community on the western edge of Cape York in northern Australia, to illustrate how language can influence thought. When asked to point north or southwest, the child can do so accurately and without hesitation. Something that Boroditsky found more difficult for an audience of Stanford University scholars to do. This is because this community doesn't have casual directional markers like left or right in their language. They only use cardinal directions, such as north, east, south, west. So, for a member of their community, it is very necessary to always orient themselves with respect to the cardinal directions to use the language. For example, they won't say, please keep the pen to the right of your notebook, but rather, first be aware of the direction in which they have to keep the pen, and then say something like, please keep the pen to the east of the notebook, if it was towards the east direction. This example highlights how the language spoken in a community can shape how people perceive and think about spatial concepts, suggesting that language isn't just a tool for communication, but also a tool for organizing and understanding the world. This example also highlights the importance of cultural context in understanding how language and thoughts are intertwined. The Ponparao community's language and culture emphasizes spatial orientation, which is reflected in the children's ability to readily point to directions, which we normally cannot do. Language shapes space, time, causality, and relationship to others. A recent movie is based upon this hypothesis and really delves into the idea of language shaping space and time. That movie is Arrival. If you have not seen this movie, then go watch it right now. I'll wait. Done? Saw it? For those who have seen the movie, you might remember that linguist Louis Banks has been assigned to the task of decoding an alien language. Their written language itself moved in circles, each sentence lacking a defined beginning or end. And as Louis starts grasping this language, starts thinking in it, her perception of reality changes. How she perceives time changes. She begins to perceive time non linearly after learning the alien heptapod language, which has no concept of past, present, or future, allowing her to see all of time simultaneously. The heptapod language is a key element in the movie, as it's not a language of words but of symbols and concepts, and it's structured in a way that allows for a non linear understanding of time. As Louise learns to communicate with the heptapods, she starts to think and perceive time in the same way the natives of that language do, seeing all events in time as a single interconnected whole. The movie touches upon the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and suggests that the structure of a language can influence the way its speakers perceive the world. Now, is this possible? No, not really. It is a much more exaggerated version of the hypothesis, and it's far from being practical. As we have understood till now, language does have an influence in how its speakers perceive the world, but only to an extent. If the alien language did actually make time non-linear for us, then that means that our languages are a barrier in developing the full cognitive potential of our brain. And this is clearly not true. Research shows that even babies lacking knowledge of any language start arranging the world that they experience into a worldview that they can trust. We are not limited by our languages. In fact, it is a loop where our cognitive abilities influences the kind of languages we create, and then the language influences the thought. That does not in any way mean that the movie is illogical and doesn't deserve to be watched. I love that film and I recommend it if you haven't yet seen it. It's a haunting reminder of how language weaves through every part of our lives, shaping how we think, feel, and see the world. Yet we still understand so little about it. Though the movie speaks of aliens, the story is really a mirror held up to ourselves. Language, and to an extent the linguistic relativity theory, has implications in law, politics, education, and journalism. It controls how we describe events or even recall a memory. People who speak different languages often vary in how they describe events, and this can influence how accurately they recall who did what. Even the quickest of incidents require us to interpret and make sense of what actually happened. Now, a good example of this is a hunting accident involving former American Vice President Dick Cheney, who accidentally shot Harry Whittington while quail hunting. Now, pay attention to how the way the event is described can shift responsibility. For instance, saying Cheney shot Whittington clearly places Cheney as a direct cause, while Whittington got shot by Cheney softens that responsibility by creating some distance. Saying Whittington got peppered pretty good removes Cheney from the sentence altogether, avoiding the agent. Cheney himself offered a more layered description. He said, "Ultimately, I am the guy who pulled the trigger that fired the round that hit Harry." A phrasing that adds chain of actions between him and the result. American President George W. Bush took the distancing even further and said Cheney heard a bird flush and he turned and pulled the trigger and saw his friend get wounded, effectively casting Cheney not as the agent of the act but as a bystander observing its consequence. We get to see this in use in our politics and media all the time. This concept has significant implications in the legal field, affecting how laws are understood and applied. The wording of laws can shape people's perceptions of their rights and responsibilities. Legal jargon can be confusing for those unfamiliar with it, potentially creating barriers to justice. Recognizing how language influences legal interpretation is crucial for ensuring fairness and clarity within the justice system. This concept also significantly impacts eyewitness testimony, as the language used can shape memory recall and interpretation. For instance, studies have shown that the wording of questions can affect eyewitness accounts. In one experiment, participants viewed a traffic accident and were later asked about the speed of the vehicles using different verbs. How fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? How fast were the cars going when they hit each other? People who were asked with the verb smashed recalled the vehicles at higher speeds than those asked with hit, highlighting how specific language choices can influence memory and perception. Language also influences how we learn things. The structure of a language can make it easier or harder for us to learn new things. Say, for example, some languages have a more consistent base 10 structure than English. English is 11, 12, but then 13, 14. But say in Chinese, the base 10 structure is consistent. Basically, they say 10 to for 12 and so forth. And so the speakers of these languages learn the base 10 insight sooner. And even depending on how many syllables the number words have, it can be easier or harder to keep a phone number in mind or to do a mental calculation. Language can affect how quickly children figure out whether they are male or female. Hebrew marks gender prolifically. Even the word you is different depending on gender. Finnish has no gender marking, and English is somewhere in the middle. Accordingly, children growing up in a Hebrew speaking environment figure out their own gender about a year earlier than Finnish speaking children. English speaking kids fall in the middle. Each language has its own cognitive toolkit, which encapsulates knowledge and worldview within a culture. And if you watch my previous video about the fear of death, you will know how important a worldview is for us. So, people who are bilingual or multilingual have multiple sets of these cognitive toolkits. And so, let's see how that works out. The naive view is that a bilingual person is someone who speaks two languages with native like fluency. However, this kind of balanced bilingualism is rare. In the vast majority of cases, bilinguals have a dominant native tongue and a second language that they can speak with some effort. Now, human reasoning is shaped by two distinct modes of thought, one that is systematic, analytical, and cognition intensive, and another that is fast, unconscious, and emotionally charged. It was believed that a second language provides a useful cognitive distance from automatic processes and promoting analytical thought and reducing unthinking emotional reactions. Therefore, those who speak two languages have better critical thinking and decision making skills. A study published a year later found that switching to a second language seems to exempt bilinguals from social norms and constraints, such as political correctness. The authors of this study surmised that a foreign language lacks the emotional impact of one's native language. Spanish psychologist Albert Costa and his colleagues experimented and reported on bilinguals and multilinguals in an article in the journal Current Directions in Psychological Science. In that, he elaborates on the topic. The risk aversion of participants disappeared when speaking in their second language. When these people were using their effortful second language, they no longer relied on intuition, but thought rationally instead. So, at least from a logical standpoint, they made a better decision in their non native language. We human want to have a reason for why things happen, and we often make casual explanations even when no such relationship exists. Superstitious behaviors arise in this way. Ordinarily, people fall prey to all sorts of logical fallacies about casual relationships. However, when they need to deal with such situations while using their second effortful language, they are less likely to make these kinds of mistakes in their thinking. Moral thinking is an area where intuition and emotion dominate our decision making processes. In one famous moral dilemma, you are asked to imagine you are on a footbridge over a trolley line. Five workers are on the track, and a trolley is racing towards them. A very large man is standing on the footbridge just above the track. And if you push him off the bridge, his large body will stop the trolley. He will die, of course, but you will save the lives of the five workers. Would you do this? A few people say yes, justifying the act from a utilitarian perspective as the greater good. However, most say no, responding from an absolute moral perspective. Killing is wrong, even if it saves more lives in the process. Who am I to decide who dies and who does not? Once again, when people are using their effortful second language, their thinking shifts from an intuitive to a rational mode. They are more likely to say they will push the large man off the bridge to save the five workers. Now, again, saying and doing are two different things. But in all these three cases, judgments of risk, causation, and morality, we see a shift from intuitive to rational thinking when people use their second language. At first, this finding is unexpected, since rational thinking itself is more effortful than intuitive thinking. Generally speaking, when we try to engage in two effortful tasks at the same time, we perform poorly at both. However, it is also important to understand what makes thinking rationally or speaking a second language effortful. It's not so much the demand on cognitive resources, as in the case, for example, when doing mental mathematics or reciting the alphabet backwards. Rather, what makes rational thought or a second language difficult is the constant need to inhibit ingrained patterns of behavior. When we speak a second language, we need to inhibit our native language. And when we think rationally, we need to inhibit our natural intuitions. We will talk about this more in depth in my next video about how the brain copes up with knowing and speaking more than one language. Brain imaging research shows that the same areas of the brain, mainly in the prefrontal cortex, are activated both in second language use and in rational thought. Apparently, once second language speakers activate their brain's inhibition center, it inhibits their intuitions and emotions too. As a result, they make more rational decisions when they're using their second language. And if you want to know what intuition really is, get subscribed as that video will also be dropping soon. Now, what if you fall under those few who speak more than one language natively or almost natively? Well, then there are still some factors that does affect your thought and reasoning. Ekaterina Matvieva is a linguist who specializes in multilingualism and multiculturalism. She has been working on the concept of the secondary linguistic personality since 2009 and is the author of the theory language alter ego. She proposes a few interesting points on this. Each language is embedded in a specific cultural context, and the cultural values and norms associated with each language can influence how multilingual individuals perceive the world. Different languages may have unique ways of expressing concepts and categorizing experiences, leading to variations in cognitive patterns and worldview. Some languages may have words or expressions that capture certain emotions more precisely than others. Multilinguals may experience different emotional nuances and may find it easier to express specific emotions in one language compared to the other. The structure and vocabulary of languages can influence how multilinguals conceptualize and describe experiences. Certain languages may have words or concepts that are not directly translatable into the other language, leading to differences in how thoughts and ideas are expressed. For example, take the word jugaad in Hindi language. It doesn't really have a word that has the same feel or the meaning in English language. And for another example, the word brain rot in English doesn't really have a word in Hindi. Multilingual individuals may adopt different perspectives and modes of thinking when using different languages. Each language may encourage a particular way of thinking or problem solving, leading to cognitive flexibility and adaptability. Language is closely tied to personality and cultural identity, and multilinguals may experience shifts in their sense of self and identity when using different languages. Each language may evoke different cultural associations and social roles, influencing how multilingual perceive themselves and others. Multilinguals may code switch or code blend between languages, incorporating elements of one language into another. This blending of languages can lead to unique cognitive processes and creative linguistic expressions. She says, even though the influence of language on thought is a subject of ongoing research and debate in the fields of linguistics and cognitive science, still the outlined empirical experiences and latest research suggests that multilinguals think differently in their languages. This is such an interesting field of linguistics and psychology, and as mentioned by Matviva, is still a subject of ongoing research. Languages influence so much in our lives, and it is of very much importance that we understand how exactly. Like the last time, all the research materials that I used for this video will be there in the description if you want to read it for yourself. In the next video, I'm going to go deeper into how exactly our brain handles knowing and using more than one language, and if it has any advantage. It's rather fascinating, and I think if you liked this video, then you would love that. So please be subscribed so you don't miss that. And also, if you did like this video, like this fucking video. And I would love to know your thoughts about all of this and your own personal experiences with it. Mention it down in the comments and we can have a chat there. Now, get the out of my face. I don't want to see you anymore.